Hi, this is Ana from the Bajo un Botón, and this is Knitting 101 Lesson 2. In this lesson, we're going to explore the knitted fabric, and that means understanding what gauge is, what tension is, and how using your tools, which we explored in the previous lesson, affects those two factors. We'll learn how the fabric comes to be, how it is formed, what its properties are, and all these little details will help you make better choices when you're working on a project, and it will help you avoid some mistakes and learn how to easily correct some other mistakes that will inevitably happen. And finally, we'll start with the actual work. We'll learn a few ways to hold your needles and your yarn, to get comfortable with them and find out what works best for you, so we can get to work. Let's talk about the knitted fabric, its characteristics, and what factors affect it. So here we have actually two pieces of stockinette stitch and one of garter stitch. As you can see, this is looking very unruly, and that's because it hasn't been dressed. This piece has been dressed, which is something that I will teach you later on in a few minutes. Now, garter stitch is made by either knitting all rows or purling all rows, which you will learn to do in time, but it's important that we talk about it a little bit before we get to that point. Now, both of these samples are 30 stitches wide and 30 rows long, but as you can see, the measurements are very different. Let me pull this over the other one, and you can see that the width is close but still not the same, and the length is definitely different. So the stitch that you use is going to affect how your fabric comes out, obviously. Also the size of the needles, and that's why this piece, which is also 30 stitches wide and 30 rows long, is smaller because it was knitted. It's the same yarn, the exact same yarn on all three samples, but these two were knitted on different size needles. These two were knitted on the same size needles. So undressed stockinette stitch tends to curl a lot, as you can see, especially when you're using a tighter stitch, a tighter gauge. Now the knitted fabric is made by one thread. This is where we cast on, and with one thread making loop after loop with your needles, you're making this fabric. So that gives it a lot of elasticity. Now some stitches or some stitch combinations will give you less elasticity than others. Garter stitch is very, very elastic. It's also thick. You can see it makes a nice thick fabric. Stockinette stitch is also very elastic because it does have, those loops, those interlocked loops that you can stretch. But it's not, especially vertically, it's not as stretchy as garter stitch is. And that is all going to affect. It has sides that are called selvages, just like in regular fabric, and you can treat them in certain ways to make them neater. This one has been made, and you can see that it moves towards the back. This is the first stitch and the last stitch of every row, and I've just slipped them. The first stitch of the row gets slipped, and it creates these nice V's, as opposed to here where it just is a continuation of the fabric and it just makes a little roll. So next we're going to talk about gauge. All right, all that gauge is or refers to, it's simply the number of stitches and rows in a given number of inches. It is one of the most important things you need to learn as a knitter, and it's very tedious, and a lot of us don't do it, and for many years I didn't measure my gauge accurately, and I suffered from it. I can tell you it's worth taking the time. It is a little bit of a pain, but it's worth taking the time to make a sample and measure it accurately. It will really save you a lot of pain when you're making an actual garment. So as you can see, I have this sample here is already all threaded up. The easiest way to measure your gauge is using your gauge ruler that we talked about earlier. The problem with it is that sometimes, all right, let's try this. We're measuring our stitch gauge here, so we're lining it up so it's all on the same row of little V's, and we're keeping the vertical side here on this side of the stitch. And again, don't put it there. It's the V's point down. You want to make sure you're measuring an actual stitch. And here is the problem. Oh, actually, there's not a problem with the stitch gauge. In this case, it would be very good because you can see how you have a perfect number of V's that fit in your 2 inches. Here it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stitches per 2 inches, or 4.5 per inch. But when we're looking at our row gauge, look what happens. If I make sure that the bottom of my ruler is on this V, on the bottom of this V, when I get to the top, it turns out that I don't have a full stitch. That would be my full stitch. So how do I measure that? Do I say it's half a stitch? I could, but it might turn out that it's a third of a stitch, and if I'm a third of a row, I'm sorry. And if I am knitting a dress that has 500 rows, that's going to add up. That's really going to make a big difference on the length. So you want to make sure you have an accurate gauge. If it fits on your nice little ruler, then lucky you, you can use it. But if it doesn't, it pays to do a little work here. And as you can see, I've simply run a thread horizontally, making sure I go over and under stitches on the same row. That's pretty easy. And here I've given you an alternative. It might be a little faster, but it's also a little less stable. And if you have to stop and move your sample, they may come off. But I've done the same thing. I've just made sure my pins run on the same row, and I've secured them on 2 stitches, so I have a nice horizontal line there. And now to measure to mark the sides, I come in a little bit. I don't put them right on the edge because, as you can easily see, this is not a very straight edge. So you want to make sure again that you are on the side here. Okay, you have a V here. You're not right in the middle of your V. You're on the side, and you're simply, I'm using a double thread just so I can really see it. It doesn't nestle in between the rows. And I'm just going to run it over quite a few rows, and now find again the little strand. And here, and one more time up at the top to secure it, and then we'll be done with this part. There, now you have another nice vertical line that you can use for your measurements. So you can use a regular ruler. I like to use my clear ruler because sometimes, you know, I can just lay it right on the pins if I need to. So let's do our row gauge. So we're going to measure vertically how many rows are here in between these 2. And let's actually count the rows first. So I'm going to say I'm going to use from this one all the way to this one. And that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23 rows. And I'm going to make a note of it so I don't forget it. And now I am going to measure. Make sure your ruler is at the bottom of your V, and it goes all the way to the top of the other V. And this is 3.5 inches. So, and you're going to have to convert your fractions into decimals. And you know, there are many guides out there if you don't know them by heart. And let's do our stitches now, and we can count them. And here, another reason why it might be easier to use the thread is because you can go over every other stitch and then you can count them in twos, and it will make it a little faster. So here's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 23, 24. Sorry, 24, 25. So you have 25 stitches. And now let's see how many inches we have here. 5.5. So that makes it easy with my decimals. And now let's make our calculation. So you're simply going to divide the number of rows between the number of inches, and that will give you rows per inch. In this case, 23 divided by 3.5, and my calculator is in Spanish, but that's a decimal point, equals 6.57, and you have a lot of decimals. You need to use at least 2 and convert the second one. And the rule of thumb is if it's 5 or above, you're going to give it to the previous one. If it's less than 5, you're just going to keep the first one. So in this case, 6.57, 7 is above 5, it's 5 or above. So we're going to say 6.6. So our row gauge is 6.6 rows per inch. And then you can compare it to your pattern, which will always give you an indication of your necessary gauge. And then let's do the same with the stitches. You have 25 stitches, and you're going to divide them by 5.5 inches, and that will give you, and now 4.54, which 4 is under 5, so you're just going to ignore it and say 4.5 stitches per inch. And that's how you calculate your gauge. And now let's just move on very quickly onto dressing your swatch. And I'm just going to move this out of the way. I showed you earlier this little swatch, this super curly guy that I had here. And this other one that I showed you earlier, that's all nice and flat, was exactly the same way. Maybe not as tight, but definitely just as curly. So you do need your swatches also, because it helps the stitches relax, and it's going to give you a little different gauge, and you're always going to end up having to wash. So a little spray bottle with some water. You can actually just wash it if you want it, but you know, for the purposes of the show, you can also, and this is what I usually do actually, and you can just make sure it's saturated. And I see that I need a little more up here on both sides. And now you're just going to get your pins, and I like the straight pins because they're harder and they don't bend so much. And these I got at the office store. They're not precious specific for knitting, but they work just fine. They're stainless steel. So you're going to start on one end. It doesn't matter if you start on your cast off or your cast on, but just stretch it out a little bit and start by putting a couple of pins on the corners, and then you're going to pin across. Once you have this side done, just start going down one of the row sides and do the same thing. One on the end, and now a few on the sides. You probably don't need as many. And as you can see, I'm just doing it on a folded towel. There are blocking boards and all sorts of fancy instruments there, but all you need is something that you can pin into and get wet. So the towel works fine. And now let's do this side. All right, and you often will need to do a little adjustment once you're done, just to make sure that it lies as flat as possible. So this is how your dress your swatches, and actually once you're knitting garments, you're going to use the same system to block your pieces. And as you can see, it's not too complicated to do. We've talked about how your yarn and your needles affect your gauge and the quality of your fabric, but your hands may have even more to do with it. So let's talk about ways to hold your needles. And this is a matter of preference and comfort, and you're probably going to go through a few until you find the one that you like best. When I learned to knit, I learned with straight needles, and I learned by actually holding my left needle under my arm and just maneuvering my right needle, which is all you need to do. Your right needle is always stationary, but you're going to move your right needle. So that is one way that you may find that it's more comfortable, that gives you more stability, and it makes it easier at the beginning. You can also hold them like I do these days, and this is another reason why now I prefer my circulars, because they're shorter, and I can just hold them like utensils, like my silverware. And again, my left hand is stationary, but it's up in the air, and I don't need to be holding anything under my arm. You can also put it over your arm like this, and I don't know if you can see it on camera, but instead of under, you can rest on the crook of your elbow there, and that also gives you more stability if you find that you need it. So the ideal thing would be to go to the yarn store and actually try a few needles and see what you like, or maybe even buy a couple of pairs so you can try them out. And we'll talk about how you hold your yarn once we get into the knitting stage. But let me just show you how the tension of your yarn will affect what you do. When you hold your yarn, and I'm going to show you this again when we start with the knitting, but let me just give you a quick intro. You can wrap it around. This is how I prefer to do it. Some people just do it like this. I like to give it that extra wrap around my pinky finger for more control. And you're going to be throwing your yarn. And when you do that, you can keep it very tight, or you can just let it rest on your fingers. And that would be my recommendation. Your stitches will be looser, and your yarn will look more relaxed and fluffier, if you will. You will allow it to show its qualities better, and it will also be easier on your hands. So keeping a loose tension, it will be very hard at the beginning. Don't worry about it too much at the beginning. Just get going and make your stitches. But as you get a little more practice and you're more comfortable with the movements, try to keep it a little looser, a little more rested. And having that extra wrap around your pinky might help you feel like that you still have control over your yarn. But again, we'll go over it again when we start knitting. Now that you understand how the knitted fabric is made and how it works, you're actually ready to start your own project. So I will see you in lesson 3, where you will learn to cast on your stitches.